Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation with Dr. Anca Hanea, PhD, Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne. Associate Professor Anca Hanea focuses on work through the University of Melbourne's Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis. She specialises in probabilistic modelling, structured expert judgment, or SEJ, and decision-making under uncertainty, with applications across biosecurity, infrastructure, and public policy. Anca has been designing and running SEJs since 2009, advancing both theory and practice by combining applied probability, optimisation, psychology, and the social sciences. Her career spans roles at the University of Melbourne and TU Delft, with teaching experience across 3 countries. She holds a PhD in applied probability and a master's degree in risk and environmental modelling cum laude from Delft University of Technology, plus a bachelor's degree in mathematics from the University of Bucharest. Welcome, Anca, and thank you for joining for this conversation.
Thanks, Paul.
So great to have you with us for this conversation, Anca. Really appreciate your time. This is such an interesting and important additional field for the risk management industry, in my opinion. I've always wondered about what I've observed to be sort of a cavernous ravine existing between the qualitative assessment methodologies and then the very sort of mathematical, data-driven assessment methodologies in risk management. So when I came across you and your area of specialisation, I was particularly keen to explore this topic more carefully, being suspicious that too much subjectivity was not sufficiently rigorous, but then also understanding that the preconditions for good quantitative analysis are not often present either. So I think your field of expertise is certainly an opportunity to sort of address that area. So I've got a couple of questions for you. One is under the title of Defining the Frontier. So like most risk professionals are familiar with expert opinion, but structured expert judgment, or SEJ, is a different beast entirely. How do you explain the fundamental difference between an informal expert consultation and the scientific rigor of SEJ?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having this chat with me. Like you already mentioned, I have a fairly quantitative background, and foundations are really important for me. So I think very often I struggle with this because I think we're being very generous when we're calling other methods just informal or unstructured. I think you kind of mentioned the absolutely fundamental difference. Some of them are unscientific. So what we're trying to do is to bring that sort of scientific rigor into this informal discussions that we have with experts, because we always have them. They're present in every step of the way, from the definition of the problem to the modeling to the quantification of the modeling parameterization. They're there all the time, and what we can do is just to bring that scientific in and just make that collection of expert data, as we often call it, as rigorous as it would be any other data collection in the field. So just following the scientific principles, make it reproducible, repeatable, document it as much as possible, plan for it. The whole process needs to be accountable, just like any other scientific process. Allow empirical control whenever that's needed. This is very much akin to calibrating measuring instruments when you collect data from the field. But then it also has that extra layer of working with humans. So we need to make sure that there's fairness in the process, and we mitigate, or at least we're aware of, all the potential cognitive and motivational biases. So there's lots to think about when you design an elicitation. There's no way we can do that without a structured protocol and very clear steps to actually account for all of the above things, I think.
It's interesting that you use the word elicitation. That's not a common word that you hear in a lot of risk workshops, for example. By elicitation, it seems like you're more precise in the way in which you're looking to elicit expert judgment. Would that be the right characterization?
I would think so. I would think we're striving to be as precise as possible. But like you mentioned in the beginning, the qualitative part of eliciting knowledge as much as numbers and rationales and reasoning is very important as well. So, but yeah, we're trying because and it's probably because my background, like I said, is quantitative. We're trying to elicit as much information as possible. And if we can put it in quantitative terms, then that's what we need to do because it will feed into models that need parameter estimates. So
Yeah. And and as you say, I mean, your background's very much to do with the mathematics of probability and fields like that. How do you practically or even sort of intellectually deal with the problem of poor data environments? So in biosecurity or emerging AI threats, we often lack historical data. So why is SEJ the gold standard for quantifying risks where traditional statistical models might fail?
um, I I wouldn't say they fail.
Right.
I would just say they're a bit insufficient because they are based on having data. So I think considering structured expert judgment as a complementing tool is the key to this modeling thing. So we're still using statistical methods, and it's just that the context doesn't necessarily justify the assumption that what we're modeling can be based on historical data. So very often we have to predict something that never happened before. So the historical data wouldn't fit the context and the assumptions that we're making in the modeling. But we still build probabilistic models. We still start with the context, the conceptual model, the probabilistic and statistical model. And very often in this process, we identify data gaps. And those are the ones that we're filling in with expert judgment because the knowledge is there. And I've met the other day a person who was not using the term expert, but they were using knowledge holders instead of experts. And I quite like that. There's a lot of knowledge in most of the problems we're dealing with. And the data is not there either because it's something about the future. So we didn't have the chance to, or we don't have the chance to wait and collect the data, or we simply didn't have the resources to do so. So we're trying to just harness all that knowledge that the experts have and put that in numerical formats to complement whatever statistical methods we have based on the data that is used to estimate parameters.
Is the role, in fact, the necessity for SEJ going to increase as future environments seem to be more complex?
I think so. I think, and we're seeing that quite a bit in when we're trying to in any biosecurity sort of setting that I'm working in now and trying to prepare for future under different climate scenarios and under different things that will happen with all the trading and everything. And the uncertainty comes from so many other parts than usual, so many moving parts, then yeah, I think the need for that will certainly increase. I don't know if the acceptance of it as a scientific tool would increase with the same sort of gradient, but yeah, I think we would have to acknowledge that there's many more connected uncertainties, dependent uncertainties that we simply don't have the data to deal with.
Interesting. There's a particular protocol which is used in your area of expertise in SEJ, which is the IDEA protocol and its associated mechanics. You were instrumental in developing the IDEA protocol, which stands for Investigate, Discuss, Estimate, and Aggregate. For a risk manager on the ground, what is the secret sauce in this four-step process that helps neutralize groupthink and overconfidence effects?
I don't know if there's just one source. I'd argue that there are a few ingredients of this secret sauce that are sprinkled throughout all the stages of this protocol. There's from the pre-elicitation stage all the way to the elicitation and the fourth part, the aggregate stage. So in the pre-elicitation part, we're striving to get diverse experts, and we don't really know what that means. So we have certain proxies for diversity in terms of worldviews, gender, age, experience, everything that we can have as a proxy for diversity. So we're trying to get as many views in the room as possible. So that's one ingredient. Have an independent facilitator, I found, helps quite a bit, not necessarily with the group thing, but with the group biases that occur with the dominating personalities, with the huge egos. Very often I'm that independent facilitator, and it's very easy for me, and it's very beneficial that I do not know who's the perceived as the best expert in the room, because then I can be fair with everyone else and I can try and draw in all the voices and understand if the quiet ones are quiet because they're feeling intimidated or because for other reasons. Then in the first step of the protocol, the investigate step, it's also there to mitigate against cognitive biases, and also to help with the discussion, in the sense that by asking individuals to put a lot of effort into that first independent individual estimate, so they do their exercise on their own, drawing on their own resources, not talking to the other experts, and that makes them very involved with their numbers and with their reasoning. And once the discussion part starts, they really need to hear really solid arguments for them to be able to change their mind. So they do their first round estimate, and then we bring them together in a room, if possible, to discuss the identified numbers. So we just have feedback plots where we present all the numbers from the group without associating numbers with people. So they don't need to talk about numbers or identify themselves on those plots. They just need to talk about the reasons behind numbers being very low or numbers being very high, or being not intersecting, or having completely different opinions. And when they do that, because they thought well and hard about their numbers, they need a good reason to change those numbers, because after this process of discussing and sharing reasoning and counterfactual scenarios, they can have a chance to go back and, without anyone knowing, change their mind or not. So we can, because of that other stage, the second stage is again independent and anonymous, no one needs to know what they're doing. So you may as well have someone in the room who nods vigorously because their boss says something that they don't actually agree with, and then independently they don't need to change anything, no one will know. Right. So it's the perceived personality, dominating personality in the room, that could distort that estimate. By having a second round that no one knows the details of, we try to mitigate against that. And we've seen that in exercises where people just choose not to change their mind, even though there was huge discussion about one question or another. They were simply not convinced, that they didn't hear anything convincing, so they don't change their mind. And then I guess the last bit of salt and pepper in that sauce is the fact that we aggregate mathematically. So the discussion doesn't need to go on forever. We don't strive for consensus. We don't ask anyone to agree on a specific set of numbers. They hear what they had to hear. They pick up information from other knowledge pools, from the other experts, because they come from different backgrounds. They read different books. They had different experiences. And at the end of that process, we just aggregate mathematically. We just have a formula where we pull all the numbers together. And the idea is that at the end, what you get is one set of estimates that doesn't necessarily fit exactly what one person or another thinks, but as a group, it incorporates all the uncertainties and all the certainties and all what was discussed, and not one expert can disagree with the final group estimate.
It's interesting as you're speaking. I'm thinking there's a lot of the behavioral science in the background in terms of structuring these, aren't there? How important is it for there to be trust between the group members and the facilitator? And you mentioned about independence and not knowing, who the big cheeses in the room are. Why is that important from your experience?
Oh, in my role as a facilitator, for me, it's important because I don't get to be intimidated because I know they are the big expert. I don't need to know that, and it doesn't intimidate me, so I can treat everyone fairly. And I can tell them to now sit down and listen if they talk too much. I'm very happy to do that. I have no skin in the game. I'm not from that community, and I don't know.
Yeah.
By me doing that, it kind of allows the other people to speak up a bit more, I
Yeah.
think. This is, again, my background is in maths. The only social sciences training that I got is through these elicitations and through my colleagues who advise on the steps of these protocols. It's just based on observation. The group dynamic is extremely important, I think. And when the group is cohesive and respectful, the discussions are just beautiful. And I learn so much with every elicitation. And it makes a full day of discussing tens and tens of questions a breeze.
Right.
And at the end of the process, everyone's happy that they participated. I've been in groups with tensions, and the fact that I'm independent helps not for the tension not to be there, but to not manifest itself.
Mm-hmm.
And again, at the end of the process, very often people are happy that that happened and they heard the others' judgments and reasoning. They don't necessarily agree until the end of the day, but they see where they're coming from. And that little bit of mutual understanding helps in making the community a bit more cohesive.
And how important is it, Anca, to be very explicit up front about, for example, your knowledge or your lack of awareness as to who has what seniority or what status within the group? Is that part of your positioning so that you can confidently interact in the way that you described?
It is absolutely. It is. You're spot on. I lead with this, and it also allows me to ask the stupid questions. It also allows me to throw in numbers that make no sense whatsoever, because very often it's so easy for people to go, oh, but that's ridiculous. That can never happen, rather than justify their own numbers, just as a conversation starter rather than anything else. Once they get going, it's very often a very rich and respectful discussion.
Very interesting. I'd like to now talk about the performance weighting concept, if I can. So, a unique aspect of your work involves scoring experts based on what I think we call seed variables or calibration questions. Can you please explain why we should weight expert opinions differently, and how can we objectively measure if someone is a good probability assessor or not?
This is a tricky one. This is it's there's only a subset of the community that advocates for seed variables.
Okay.
I am part of that subset for sure. I think seed variables are extremely important and they bring huge value to an elicitation. I don't always have the chance to have them in my elicitations, but if I can, I always try to. And I think they are slightly misunderstood. So in the beginning, one of your questions, I asked about that empirical validation of the exercise, which is pretty much calibrating the measurement, like a microscope when you're measuring something. I think that's the way the calibration questions are used, but it's very easy to see them as grading the experts. We've had people saying, "Well, I'm going to be graded as a like a student," and that's not what we're doing this. But because of that tension, I think it's part of the community doesn't necessarily use them. So the way I think there's two main points where calibration or seed questions make the elicited data better. One is when, especially in the IDEA protocol, where we have individual experts give their estimates, and then we have a discussion, and then after the discussion, they have the chance to change their mind. Between those two rounds, we think and we claim that the discussion makes things better, makes the estimates more accurate, more calibrated, more informative. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So one step is to actually cross-check and verify and validate that the steps of the protocols that we're using are actually doing what we think they're doing. They're improving these estimates. And another very valuable contribution is at the end of the process, when we aggregate everything and we just use a group assessment, we can also check if that group assessment is better in terms of more informative or calibrated if we use equal weights or if we use differential weights based on performance. We can justify that the aggregation that we choose is the best that we can have. So what we're measuring with this calibration, so these are questions for which we either already know the answers, the experts don't. We know the answers with precision. There's a true value for say 10 questions. The experts either have seen these answers at some point and they use them further in their modeling, but they don't have them at hand. Or these are experiments that are running at the moment and the answers will become available very soon after this elicitation. And what we're checking is, and again, we're asking questions numerically, but we acknowledge the uncertainty. So the experts will give 1 point estimate, but also a lower bound and an upper bound in terms of worst case scenario, best case scenario. So an interval for each question. So what we're looking at on a long term for a good probability assessor would be that they capture the realization, the true value between their bounds on a long run. So for most of those 10 questions, say, and also to capture them with informative answers. So a non-informative answer would be those bounds are so spread apart they don't actually contain any more information. I could just assume the simplest distribution, uniform distribution that doesn't tell me anything more. An expert should be a bit more informative than that. So we're looking for calibrated answers that are also informative. We measure those two, we combine them because we want both qualities. And then based on that score, we have weights that are proportional with this score. That's what we're calculating. Now, we can do exactly the same before and after the discussion. So the first two things that I said that I think calibration question seed variables are very important is checking if after the discussion, experts do get more calibrated and more informative. And that's every time we check, that's what we've seen. So that's why we have the confidence that the steps are doing what they're meant to be doing. Not always, because it's a statistical process, but it's more often than not, when experts change their mind, they do change towards the direction of the truth. They do decrease the uncertainty, so those intervals become narrower than they were initially because ambiguity got resolved, because conditioning factors in the questions got clarified. So that happens. And then at the end of that process, on the same questions that we know the answers for, we can check these aggregations. So we can see if the aggregation that we're finally using has the best scores as well, just like we would think of that aggregation as a virtual expert. That's the one that will represent the group. So I think that there's huge value in having calibration questions. They're hard to find, and they're based on the assumption that you find them such that they will trigger in the experts the same sort of thought processes and mental models that the questions you're interested in trigger. If they're not exactly representative for the questions of interest, then the criticism is, well, you don't know if they are a good predictor for future performance.
Got it.
We very often think they are. Again, it's not, I would love it to be a theorem that proves that to be true, but there is none.
At this stage, at least.
At this stage. There's a lot of data. So the Technical University of Delft studies are collected into a data set. and there's a lot of validation on those data sets. And it's always, every time someone looks at it, it looks like they're adding value.
Fascinating. There's a couple of questions that come to mind in relation to that approach. One of the questions, I guess, is there transparency around the rating of the decisions back to the expert?
So the experts, when we have calibration questions, the experts always know that there will be calibration questions.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they may be identified, sometimes they're not. So they don't necessarily know which one. If the questions are based on past events, they will identify themselves which were the calibration questions. So, but they always know. And we always tell them that their individual scores, it's only whoever calculates them knows them, that they don't become public in any way. And whoever wants to know their scores, they are welcome to ask for them.
Okay.
And in my experience, 20% of experts ask for their scores and they're happy to know it. And the reactions are very often very kind. Like if they have good scores, they're happy that they have good scores. If they don't have such good scores, they're happy that the aggregation has good scores. And as a group, they did well, which is the right attitude to have.
Of course.
And most of them have it after they go through the process. They may start as being nervous, but I've never had an expert who was unhappy with at the end of the process.
It sounds like you've got some quite mature experts. I can imagine in some organizational contexts and cultures that competitiveness would loom quite large.
I assume so. But like I said, many of them start being very nervous at the start of the process.
Yeah.
They don't all feel comfortable with the approach. But by the end of it, they recommend it to other people. So I guess going through the process, it makes them understand that we're not interested in their individual score in any way. It's not a test of knowledge. It's not a test of expertise. It's simply trying to get the best out of the group that we have.
Yes. So communicating that, emphasizing that's important because there's not a lot of assessments which are quite like that in that sense. We tend to be quite individualistic and we tend to quite naturally rank ourselves against our peers. So yeah, I can see how handling that message is important. You made the point that some people in the field aren't advocates of the seed variable approach, if I've expressed that correctly.
Yeah.
And I had the sense from your response that part of that reason was that perhaps they're not convinced that the questions which are being asked to determine the expert weightings are necessarily sufficiently, I'll use probably a poor word, but representative. That seems to me that to get to prepare the right question seems like that must be quite an important part of the preparation process.
It is. You're absolutely right. It's a lot of work. It's more work than the questions that you don't have the answers for, because especially for that, because you want to have questions that actually are meaningful for the questions you're interested in. You want them to be hard to find if the answers are available, so you don't get no one gaming the system. Yeah. So it is a big chunk of work. And what we usually have is we do have a few experts that don't necessarily participate in the elicitation, but help us with finding data sets or with experiments that are not published. We always have to have some angels on the inside, because otherwise we don't find the good ones. So that's, yeah. And in some applications, there is a catalog of seed questions because they were used more often, like in volcanology, for example. There's the Willie Aspinall has been running expert elicitations for years and years. Is the longest running elicitation in a particular field. So there is, and very often Willie and his team publish the seed questions. So volcanologists always have access to a catalog of potential questions that help with developing new ones. And if that were to become good practice for everyone, that'd be amazing. And it's starting to be. Calibration questions are very often published with the other questions.
Practical application. Lessons from the border. Your work with CEBRA, which I understand is the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, often focuses on biosecurity, an area with high stakes, but also high uncertainty. What is one specific insight or risk that SEJ uncovered in biosecurity that traditional data-driven methods might have missed?
Yeah, again, a tricky one. I don't know if SEJ on its own can do that much. But being, I think the Biosecurity Risk Center I work for and the people I'm working with and their willingness to use that tool as one of the tools in their toolbox, I think that's the key here. Because the value, very often what we look at in the biosecurity projects that we're dealing with is trying to understand the value of future actions and potential management actions under finite resources. So a resource allocation sort of for management actions to mitigate against future threats is very hard to know if we avoided the risk or not. A good decision avoids a risk, and then it's hard to measure if it was your decision or any other things that happened in the same context. So what we do in this context for resource allocation, so for example, if we're interested in certain pest or disease that we want to keep outside Australia from neighboring countries, or even if we want to keep outside Tasmania, it's on the mainland, but it didn't make it to Tassie. We simulate scenarios where the pathways for those pests and pathogens are described and modeled, and then we look at what can we mitigate. Can we invest pre-border, so then we help our neighbors mitigate against that pest and pathogen, and that will reduce the likelihood of the pest to come to Australia? Or do we invest in more inspections at the border? Or do we invest in surveillance protocols that would allow for very early detection? And then we start comparing those things. And there's different moving parts of the modeling. And again, some of it can be informed by data, but some of it there's no way we have data for. So that's where expert judgment is extremely important, and the willingness of the government officials or the border officers or people who know about these problems, their willingness to answer our questions in these structured protocols that we're using. I think that's the key methodology that we need to have a complete picture of what could happen and what values would be affected if an incursion of something else happens.
The human element, heuristics and biases, you touched on this a little bit at the very beginning. Even the smartest experts are prone to cognitive biases like anchoring. How does the discussion phase of your protocol specifically target these mental shortcuts without letting the loudest voice in the room take over? And I know that you've spoken about some of those controls already, but anything further to reflect on there, Anca?
Yeah, you mentioned anchoring, and that's definitely one of the strongest individual cognitive bias that we know of. And the first thing we do is making the experts aware of that, because I don't think, some people think about it, but some people don't realize that it happens to us and don't realize how strong these biases can be. And the fact that because we ask them for such hard things, like thinking under uncertainty, it's very hard how much they use their rules of thumb and mental models and shortcuts, and how much that can. So we make them aware. That's the first. We initially have a meeting with everyone explaining why we're doing things the way we're doing them, why we need diversity, why we ask the questions in the way we're asking. So, for example, earlier I said that we're asking the experts for a best estimate and then an upper and a lower bound.
Yeah.
And very often we found that if we ask exactly like this, just give me your best estimate and then upper and lower, very often, because they anchor on that best estimate, the interval around the best estimate tends to be too narrow. So they appear overconfident. They don't mean to necessarily. So one way of mitigating against that is to ask them to first consider the counterfactuals. That still gives them two anchors, but at least they don't tend to go a best estimate and a plus minus small variation around it. So by thinking of what's the worst that can happen, what's the best that can happen, and put everything in balance and give, that's one way of trying to mitigate against their own anchoring. Then we kind of use the anchoring to our advantage by asking them, and I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, asking them to first do the first estimates to be like their individual work. And they anchor so much on their numbers that it has to be in the discussion, they have to hear something very convincing to change or move those answers, because they're, again, that anchoring bias on their own private initial estimate is very strong. The availability bias is another one that comes up very often. And when we're answering the questions, we all use that. It's the first thing that comes to mind. It's what's available for us. And then bringing them together. So most of the individual biases can be mitigated against with the group. By bringing everyone together, we kind of bring those availability biases like pieces of the puzzle on the same table. And then they can complement and just enlarge that knowledge base that they're using. The group biases, there's having an independent facilitator, like I mentioned earlier, that helps a little bit. And also having that second round of estimates where no one needs to know if you changed your mind or not, that tends to help again. And not striving for consensus allows them to just finish the conversation when no one has anything else to add to the reasoning and counterfactuals thinking, and then just moving on. And that's all we can do. And there's different sort of studies that try and look if the mitigation strategies actually work. And again, we can't say we can prove that this works, but that's what we're trying to do.
But again, I get the feeling that these are conversations that, if not handled well, could be quite challenging. I mean, biases, I guess, can signal to somebody almost like a deliberate attempt to prejudice something. But I think the honesty and the directness and the plainness of speaking that you're using, and helping the experts in the elicitation to understand why these areas are important to deal with up front, I can just imagine is a very constructive discussion, and possibly quite helpful and refreshing for some of the experts as well, as they perhaps need to be more explicit, or at least start to confront those more in a more explicit way, some of those hidden biases that might be present.
It is very often very well received, and people do, like you said, people do bring up mental models that they just have and never verbalized or never articulated or explained to someone else. So it does help their own sort of thinking. But the deliberate sort of biases, the motivational ones, those are very hard to mitigate against. The only thing that we can do, I've never had anything like that, because it's usually technical experts that are asked about parameters, not trying to separate as much as possible their values and utilities. But I think the only way to mitigate against that is asking for numbers and parameters that are inputs in models, so they can't immediately calculate what the output will be to be able to manipulate those numbers.
Right.
So make it harder for them.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. You've always got to be a step ahead, don't you?
A little bit, yeah.
So let's talk about strategy and leadership. A lot of people involved in the Institute of Strategic Management are interested in the executive perspective, even the governance perspective from a board level. Risk professionals often struggle to convince executives or directors of subjective probabilities. How does the transparency and traceability of SEJ help a risk officer defend their assessments in a corporate or even governmental setting?
Well, I would hope, like I said, I'm towards the naive side of the scientists who think that if you provide good scientific arguments, that will be convincing enough for people to take action based on that. So from that naive perspective, just having a transparent methodology and a traceable process that helped you get to those numbers should be good enough. But I think a more convincing argument is that very often we do that because we need to answer crucial questions. So a risk manager needs to take a decision, and there's not many options. If you're not using expert judgment, what you can do is ignore the question altogether because you don't have enough data to actually get an answer that makes a precise answer or an answer that it's easily obtainable. So the alternative is ignoring the question, or you can use this methodology to acquire a more approximate answer, maybe, to the question that you're really interested in, and acknowledging the uncertainties, which is not that appealing for many risk managers, but at least you can always frame it in terms of the best case scenario, worst case scenario, and get an informed decision based on an approximate answer. I think that should be enough. I don't know if it always is. It is for some risk managers, but I do acknowledge that very often you can't convince your risk manager to go with the methodology that you're suggesting.
The cost of informality. We often see organisations rely on single subject matter of expert for critical decisions. They might be within the organisation. They might be consultants who are held in very high regard. Based on your research, what are the hidden risks of relying on individual expertise versus a structured group aggregation?
So many. It's overconfidence, I guess, would be the first one. Not having the entire picture, not having the chance of discussing those reasons or rationales behind the advice with people with a completely different worldview, not necessarily thinking of all potential counterfactuals or anyone challenge your views. There's so much. It simply leads to very confident but very often wrong answers. I think it's a real danger.
I'm also, as you're speaking, and maybe you're too polite to mention it, but I can also see a potential conflict of incentives as well in the process, particularly if it's a paid subject matter expert, a consultant whose credibility perhaps depends heavily on presenting themselves to their client as the expert.
Absolutely. Those motivational biases are just, yeah, there's no way you can control for them if you have only one expert.
Okay. So artificial intelligence and SEJ, hot topic, I'm sure, within the field, and of course, AI more broadly for all of us. As we move into an era of large language models and AI-driven analytics, do you see SEJ becoming or risking becoming obsolete, or does it become even more critical as a way to ground or validate algorithmic outputs?
I don't think SEJ is in trouble or in any danger of becoming obsolete, because AI algorithms can be fantastic, but they're trained on existing data. And that's the exact reason we need structured expert judgment, is because we don't have the historical data to train our models or our estimates. And even though AI can dig a lot deeper and have a lot more information, it would still not have that exact future prediction that we're needing. And yeah, no, absolutely no danger, I don't think. But I think a combination of the two would be absolutely essential, because we can use having that tool at our fingertips when we, in the pre-elicitation stage, for example, we prepare background documents for experts just to make sure everyone starts with the same basis and everyone anchors their answers on what we know to be true. Using AI to prepare all of those and make sure we didn't miss anything could be a huge help. Having summarized the discussion, if we sometimes have elicitation that are asynchronous and we have the discussion documented as comments or on a platform, having a tool that summarizes the main points and triggers counterfactual thinking in the experts, that would again be very useful. So a combination, I think, would be the way to go.
Excellent. And perhaps a final question as we think about the practitioner in mind. For a risk manager reading this ISRM journal article or watching this video, and they want to move away from gut feel, but doesn't have a PhD in mathematics or statistics like yourself, what is the first step they should take to start integrating structured judgment into their risk framework?
Well, I guess if they're open enough to do that, I think they've already made a huge first step. If they're confident that structured expert judgment and the protocols that have been developing since the 90s are actually a scientific method of using, it's already huge. So that's great. Of course, there are papers and there are books and there are blogs and all sorts of communications that can make these tools more accessible. But I think that the beauty of the main principle of structured expert judgment is they're simple, they're elegant, and yeah, simple, I think, is the right word. You can make it as complex as you want if you have a PhD in maths and if you want to have more sophisticated aggregation tools and more measures, but you don't need to. The first principles are simple. And I think what's important to remember is we're a friendly bunch. Just reach out. Everyone in this community will be happy to help because we passionately think that this is a good tool that everyone should have access to. And if done properly, it does advance the modeling and the estimation and the predictions. So I guess that would be my advice. Just reach out.
That's fantastic. And I can certainly say my first-hand experience has been certainly reaching out to you, population sample of one. You've been incredible, which may not be very rigorous, but
I'm
nonetheless,
representative.
I'm sure it's representative. Thank you for that. And you've been incredibly generous at the seminar that we had back in 2025 and then also in this interview. So, and I know from that talk, the webinar that we did attracted a lot of interest, which is one of the things that has, motivated, really, I hope both of us to have this further discussion. It's been incredibly helpful. Anca, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having this. Thank you for your time as well and all your questions.
Thanks, Anca.